We now move on to our next session. We'll be discussing on the book, there's a discussion on the book Nizam-i-Bhopal by Lieutenant General Milan Naidu, and he's in conversation with Mr. Vertul Singh. I request both the gentlemen to please step on the stage. Yes, sir. Lieutenant General Milan Naidu was commissioned in the Rajput Regiment in 1967 and gave his 41 years of glorious service. A graduate from Canadian Forces Staff College, Toronto, he did his post-graduation in military studies from Madras University. The general tenated the appointments as an instructor at the Infantry School and the Indian Military Academy. He was posted in staff assignment in the Military Operations Directorate at the Army Headquarters, the Operations Branch in the Corps Headquarters, and as the Chief of Staff of a Corps. He was also appointed as the Military Attaché in Germany. The general was the commandant of the Army War College and was later appointed as the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief of the Army Training Command. Finally, he went on to be the Vice Chief of Army Staff. On retirement from the Army in 2008, he was appointed as a member of the Armed Forces Tribunal at New Delhi. He finally retired in December 2013 and decided to return to Bhopal after 50 long and eventful years in the armed forces. It is a privilege to have you amongst us, sir. Talking about our discussant, Mr. Vertul Singh, he holds a postgraduate diploma in journalism and mass communication, currently posted in a senior position with the Government of India. He was commissioned in the Indian Army and left as a captain. He was selected for the CISF in the 1994 batch of UPSC, served as a spokesperson for the UN police in Kosovo, and has also been in deputation to the Ministry of Home Affairs. He published various books including Bhopal Nama, and he has also over 200 articles and book reviews to his credit and has written popular weekly columns for the Bangalore Mirror and the DB Post. He is currently working on a compendium of Hindi literature of the 20th century. It is again an honor to have you, sir, amongst us, and now I hand over the discussion to both the gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, General Naidu. Good afternoon, audience. Let me first tell you about the book around which our discussion is going to be held today. The book is titled Nizam-i-Bhopal, and it deals with the military history of the erstwhile Bhopal state. This particular book, unlike what the one I wrote, Bhopal Nama, is an extremely well-researched with a whole list of references. And in the details in which General Naidu has covered, it only shows his passion and his interest in the military strategies.
Maybe.
Thank you, Brigadier Sanjay. In fact, this particular book is one book which I would recommend anyone who wants to know about the military strategies and the military, the army, particularly the military regulations, rules in the erstwhile Bhopal state, not comparing with the modern day army. General Naidu, my first question is rather a very cliched one, in which generally people talk about is what actually motivated you to write this book. And the second part of this question is, who are your target readers on whom you have generally based your book about?
Thank you, Vertul. In fact, if I may say so, my main motivation was you.
Grateful.
Vertul used to write articles every Friday in DB Post. Now DB Post is no longer there. And every Friday religiously I used to make a cutting out of it and put it in a file. So one day I just met him, happened to meet him, and I told him, why don't you write a book? So he said, yes, I'm doing that. I've been told and I'm compiling it. But that kind of created an interest in me about Bhopal. Firstly, I must concede, I'm a Bhopali. I call myself Bhopali. So I had all the reasons to be happy about it because there were a lot of things I didn't know about the town. And I got to know from his articles. I read the book much later, of course. But the thing is, the main person who got me into it was one Mr. M.M. Upadhyay. He is an IAS officer. He is the chairman of the intact chapter for Madhya Pradesh. And he was one who said, you must write on militaries of Bhopal because no one has written about it. For 1 year, I didn't bite. So every day in the evening, very often, every week perhaps, he would come, have some whiskey in the evening. We used to talk the same thing, but I never said yes. Subsequently, I would visit him. The same thing used to take place, same conversation. Again, nothing happened. But after a year, finally I gave up. And I decided I'll do something. I went to Delhi, tried to check out, and where I was able to find out that all the records which were there were in England. So squadron leader Chinna was there, Man Chinna. He is a very knowledgeable person, and he was the main coordinator for the commemoration ceremony in India of the First World War. So he knew about a lot of things. He also gave me references in Delhi where I could access some material. I came back to Bhopal, and here I found all records in Urdu and Farsi. So that was the next mountain I had to climb. Fortunately, a schoolmate of mine, Taj Muhammad, he introduced me to one Mr. Kaleem Akhtar, very senior man. He is here, and in fact, a graduate of 1963, and I was, the moment we decided, yes, he is interested in history, he knew a lot about Bhopal, he said, I'll help you. I was lazy, he was the one who was pestering me. When can you come? Sir, let's go. I would tell him, sir, let's hang on, next week, I'll tell you and all that. Finally, I felt ki gawa chust muddai sust. So finally I decided to go with him. I had a very interesting interlude with him which carried on for almost 5 years. And every day we would go to the National Archives, State Archives, go through all the things, and he is a storehouse of knowledge about Bhopal. But I was more looking at military history. And that's the time I realized pure military history in any case is very boring. And military history takes the cake. So it's very, very difficult and everyone can't even follow that. So I said ki I must interpose it with some issues of Bhopal. And that's where Vertul Singh came to my assistance, and of course the knowledge of Mr. Kaleem Akhtar and a lot of references. I had a very interesting time. I stand educated as a Bhopali and very, very happy about it. A lot of self-satisfaction.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. General Naidu, my second question to you is, in your book you have mentioned something which, excuse my name dropping, but let me tell you, the two books which almost came very close to each other and which dealt with almost the same topics. One was, of course, Mr. Shashi Tharoor's Era of Darkness and Dalrymple Anarchy. So I have read those two books in detail because I have a passion for history, particularly that era of history. Sir, one thing which you have mentioned in your book, both these two books doesn't have. And that is about a very interesting part about EIC officer, that is the East India Company officers. East India happened to be one of the very high paying, one of the corporates, as William Dalrymple has compared with, he's drawn analogy with the modern corporates and the then East India Company. They were big paymasters. So all the British officers who made their mark in the global war, like in the American independence or elsewhere with the Prussian war and whatever, they used to opt for some pay, and of course Oriental was as exotic as it is now, considered now. But within this EIC, there were a group of, as General Naidu has mentioned, Her Majesty government's officers. Now, I found this very interesting because Her Majesty's government officers and East India Company officers, there was a big tug of war. And he has rightly mentioned that they were primus inter pares. They were something elites among the elites, first among the equals. They also used to look down upon the EIC officers. Can you please elaborate on that, General Naidu?
Actually, it is something like what happens amongst the central government services. You are assigned to a state, and then you sometimes opt for the center. So you have to volunteer, and otherwise people like to go there for experience, as also other perks. But while in the Nawab service, as an officer, and if you were qualified, you could opt and go into the British side. Naturally, you were paid better, there is no doubt, and perhaps you also had more powers. So the sense of self-satisfaction that one got was certainly a little better than what perhaps it would have got it while remaining with the state. So that is the reason why they wanted to move. But of course, the Nawab also didn't want the best officers to go. So they would, like the tussle goes on even now. So they said, okay, you can go, you can go. So sometimes a chap was kicked up, and sometimes he was just withheld, and maybe with some allurements he was made to stay put in the state.
Were they, my hunch is that the Her Majesty government officers, they also played a role of some kind of an ombudsman. Because most of them thereafter, if you see, like Cunningham was there and a host of other officers, they were appointed political agents. And they thereafter wrote some of the best books what we can consider today as reference books.
Very true. Actually speaking, since they knew the society very well, they were in a better position to articulate and also help the government, the British government, in the sense to ensure that their hold on the Indian system gets stronger and better. So it was a kind of symbiotic affair between the officers who wanted to opt for the company and the British government who wanted to take such people who were emancipated, educated, and aware.
My third question, General Naidu, is today, just before your session, pre-lunch, we had a wonderful discussion with Ambassador Puri on the Sikhs. And I told you attended that session too. But my question is different from here. In your book, you have mentioned that when the British officers were deployed on the request of the Nawab of Bhopal, the Begamat of Bhopal, the thereafter Begamat, they did not match up with the expectations. The local troops did not match up with the expectations of the British officers. So there was a request sent to the Sikhs to come and join Bhopal State Army, and you have covered up wonderfully about the descendant of one of those this thing, and you traced them. I remember my conversation with you also, who had a residence near the Sultania Lines. So please throw some light for the benefit of our audience.
You see, initially when the Bhopal army was raised, it was raised in two forms. One was supposed to be under the British control, which was located in Sihor. That was part of the treaty. This was signed in 1817. And
Nazar Muhammad.
So after that, there were state forces who were supposed to be feeding this unit, which was there in Sihor. Now, the Nawab had a very self-imposed restriction that they will only go in for Muslims, that too from within the state. There were not very many here. Actually, except for the town of Bhopal, which had maximum number of Muslims, there were hardly any Muslims in the rural areas. There were just 30%. So it was difficult for them to get, and especially riders. That is the time they decided to open up the recruitment, so to say, to others. And at that point of time also, the Sikhs had been defeated. Maharaja Ranjit Singh had been defeated, and they decided Sikhs were also a good resource which they could exploit. So Sikhs were taken in Bhopal army, and they were recruited both in the state government forces as also that levy. Subsequently, that levy changed the name. There were only British officers there. Here
Just explain, they might not understand what levy is all about. If you could just elaborate on that.
in the sense that the treaty ordained that there will be so many number of men and so many number of horses, that is the riders who will be there, which included horses, and it will be maintained by the state. The state was paying for them. And this continued for quite some time, till such time, just before the First World War, they decided to change the system, where instead of the state paying, they said, okay, we will be funding the entire force. So the system changed much later, that was almost about 100 years later.
I would also ask you, again I'm referring to those two books, Era of Darkness and Anarchy, that railway as a strategy, as a war strategy, how far do you agree with Mr. Shashi Tharoor when he says that railways was not meant as a kind of a welfare measure for the masses? On the contrary, it was more of a strategy to penetrate deeper and deeper into the subcontinent by the British.
No, I would put it differently. Railways were meant to further their business interests. It was basically the business interest to get things from the rural areas to the ports. So all the produce which was there, which was being attracted to the ports. So that was the main theme of the railway. The Britishers also invested heavily in terms of funding this project. But the Nawabs of Bhopal, that time all lady Nawabs, they were very emancipated. They had a good foresight, and they invested their personal money in order to fund this rail project. And when they fell short of money, they again gave some private funds. Now it was not government funds, that is not British funds, Bhopal state funds, but they were personal funds of the Nawab.
Particularly Qudsiya Begum.
Sikandar,
Qudsiya Begum's personal Jagir, yes.
Thereafter, when the railway line came up, the first railway line came up, it was horizontal, that is towards Sihor. Now they realized that that is not good enough. They must have north-south. So they were the ones who pushed for the connection to Agra.
And that what exists even now, connecting, rather putting Bhopal on the map of the railways. Basically, railways was also meant to get the outsiders into the Bhopal state to do the general administration of the conduct the general administration of the state, whereas we don't find too many. When we talk about Nizam of the Bhopal state did not have many local administrators. When we hear the stories about various rajas who were called from outside, one such raja's name just appeared recently, who was from Aligarh. So that was also one of the aims. And particularly Hamidullah Khan was one man who called a lot of his Aligarh Muslim universities cronies to run the administration of the state. Where do you put this administrative setup vis-a-vis the military setup of Bhopal?
No, by then the military had acquired a different dimension altogether. The World War was on, World War II, when Hamidullah took over, and he was unable to run the state because most of the educated Bhopalis had joined the forces, and especially the British Army, British Indian Army. And British Indian Army, all said and done, was paid very well, and most of them landed up as officers. Some of them also landed up in the ranks in the British Indian Army. They were all paid very well. And since there was a shortage of good people, educated people in Bhopal, so they decided to get people from outside. And of course, a good resource was that Aligarh University where he had studied. Nawab Hamidullah Khan had studied in Aligarh. Not only that, he was an active participant there in all the activities in Aligarh, and Britishers were eyeing him because they thought he's been influenced by the communists. Also, he was the only graduate in that Chamber of Princes, and therefore he was elected as the convener twice during that period.
That's very right. In fact, I have also mentioned in my book about the background behind the scene political maneuvers regarding Nawab Hamidullah Khan. And there were many instances where I come across, this is my personal analysis, that he was more influenced by Ataturk. That time, the modern Turkey which was being carved out, the caliphate was being destroyed, and how Ataturk was changing the map of the entire Turkey as a country and the caliphate per se. That was one reason the British were also pretty alarmed about his communist link. Secondly, he was also very much attached with Nehruvian ideology. It's a very interesting thing because pre-independent India, there were not many heroes to emulate, particularly of that persona of Nawab Hamidullah Khan, and they had many things in common. I mean, both loved life, they had their weaknesses, Nehruji or Nawab Hamidullah, so they complemented each other in many different ways. Okay, coming back to, we just digressed from the topic. Coming back to your book in particular, you have mentioned in great detail about the payment part of it and how many paisas and about the uniform and how the uniform were discussed and how eventually they arrived at, about the insignia, how frequently the uniforms were changed, how frequently the insignias were changed. I asked this question again, one of my first sessions here with Mumtaz Khan. You might have heard his name too, the fashion designer. Who were the people who actually designed that? Who were the people who actually came in, gave the seal that, well, this will be the uniform. This will be the pattern of the uniform. Because I find it, I didn't come across any big name, and uniform happens to be a very important part. Army is all about uniform. We would like you to tell us in detail about it, as much as you have written in your book.
You see, in those days, the issues that were discussed were at a lower level. The commanding officer was all in all, and he had a great say in what the troops should wear and what they should do. So there was, I don't think, much of a discussion to be held, and it was more the uniform change took place because of the convenience and because of the functional capability of the troops. Initially, they had followed some kind of a ceremonial order, which perhaps they had acquired from the princely states. But subsequently, they realized that all this kind of ceremonial order will not work. And with the modern warfare that was going on, they decided to change. Once the army became one and there was more control of the British, you see, there was, in the First World War, after independence, the control of the army became a little more severe. Subsequently, before the First World War, they decided to have a scheme, Indian troop scheme, in which they decided to have a particular pattern, both dress, equipment, the training, inspection. There was an inspector of training. Thereafter, Second World War, between First and Second World War, lessons learned, they again changed. So the change was constant. And as perhaps the communication systems grew, the organization became more organized, then the level of decision making also rose.
And something about the insignia. How were the insignia came into like this particular battalion? Particularly, you have talked about levy, this thing, and the riders you have differentiated, the cavalry and the infantry. Would you like to elaborate on that too?
This was actually insignias were an adoption of the British pattern. Thereafter, you see, even Bhopal also acquired a logo insignia, which was, in fact, till very recently being used even by the municipal council here in Bhopal. Now they have, of course, changed and put Raja Bhoj there in between.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it is the same insignia which has been used, which was always there with the Nawab. And even during the Nawab time, it kept changing.
Mhm.
Sometimes there was a fish, sometimes they wrote Bhopal, sometimes they wrote something else. So there has been, it's a matter of constant change depending on the rationale at that point of time.
And again, at least I think 3 chapters of your book, 3 or 4 if I'm not wrong, devote exclusively to the First and the Second World War. The contribution of the Bhopal State Army, state forces in the First and the Second World War. Now, my question to you is, what was the compensation? What was so important for Nawab to be identified with British? It was already a very well established, and there was no threat to Bhopal per se, as it was during, let's say, Sikandar Begum's time or Shah Jahan Begum's time, that they always had to go out of the way to, please the British. But Nawab Habibullah Khan, well, in the First World War, of course, Sultan Jahan was there, but Nawab Hamidullah Khan, some or the other played the as the background operator. What was the compensatory thing for them to devote their well-trained troops and pay so much of this thing for in the First and Second World War?
I think during both the world wars, they ensured that the British story or the narrative which was created by the British was accepted by the other powers, especially Indian princes. And there was no state or no princely state which went against the Britishers. Firstly, Britishers were all in all, they were very powerful. So no one went against them. Secondly, by then perhaps they were also convinced that they have to contribute towards the wars. When Indian army reached France by ship, Bhopal battalion was the first battalion to land in France. Thereafter, they were deployed in France. They fought a lot of battles. 1 full year they were there. Then they were pulled out. They went to Mesopotamia. There they won a Victoria Cross. Then they came back at the end of the war. Then there were changes. Again the changes. Second World War. Not only this battalion, which was in Sior, or that Sior battalion, and it was known as 9th Bhopal Battalion in the First World War, that battalion took part in the Second World War. It also, by then, created 3 more battalions. Though they were sent to Mesopotamia, they didn't have a regular battle, or they didn't fight a regular war, because by then everything was under control. Plus, Sultania infantry also took part. And they did a good job also. They were deployed in North Africa, they were deployed in Greece, and they performed very well while in Greece, in one of those islands. Their performance was excellent, which was commended by the Britishers, and therefore in turn by the Nawab, who gave them certain awards and things like this. So that is all.
Okay, my next question to you is, tell us some very interesting thing which you, while researching your book, which can be very contemporary, something about Sultania infantry or something about the present day setup. Let's say about the building in which the present DSY is set up. And general layout of the Sultania infantry lines. You have dealt, by the way, I would like to tell the audience that I am deliberately not touching too much about the book because it will, only the peripheral aspects are being touched, which will generate some interest for you all to at least go and purchase this book and read for yourself what all it's written. But General Naidu, we would like to know something which relates to the contemporary setup vis-a-vis the history of Sultania Lines and surrounding areas.
Sultania Lines earlier was actually the cavalry lines. It is only in 1911 the change took place, where Jahangirabad was a fresh set of buildings and things like this, where infrastructure was created, and which is now the so-called police lines. That was the cavalry lines. So they changed over, the cavalry moved from this place to that way. They found the red soil there better for horse riding and things like this, while the black soil was okay for the infantry guys. So it was, the infantry came here. And during the period of Second World War, since the infantry also grew, the Sultania infantry had to be beefed up. So a whole lot of new buildings came up. The hospital was here. The veterinary hospital was there. By the way, veterinary hospital exists in the same place today. And that hospital, of course, got a new building and a new facade and things like that. That's a different thing. Location is still the same. And here, of course, a lot of changes took place. While after 1962, between 1949 and 1962, there was no army in Bhopal. In 1962, army started coming in. So Baragarh was created. Now they are in 3 blobs: Sultania, Baragarh, and Dronachal, which they call it, the Nyori Hills. They have been renamed as Dronachal. So Dronachal is the 3rd blob. So the cantonment is in 3 blobs, displaced from each other, but quite within striking distance. Jahangirabad continues to be with the police, and it is still the police lines.
Okay, my second last question. Thereafter, I'll ask my last question. The second last question pertains to the Bhopal region and the Bhopal state. Now, the question arises, particularly when I was also writing my book, there was a lot of overlap about and talk about Bhopal region and the Bhopal state as such. Now, like an aging courtesan, it continues to be as seductive as Bhopal area in particular. I never went out of Bhopal for this very reason. When you were writing your book, what from the military angle, where did you draw your map? Because you have mentioned about the topography of Bhopal region, not the Bhopal state.
No, if you can restrict yourself topography of Bhopal state per se, it is very difficult to explain and get the hang of it. It has to be the region. When you are discussing mountains, rivers, they will transcend the borders. So it is about the region. But let me also tell you that Bhopal region earlier was part of the overall governance of state. For example, Dhar Empire, or if you want to call it that Raja Bhojka Empire or whatever, they had influence here. Perhaps they didn't have a direct rule, but they had influence here. Therefore, Bhopal state per se was subjugated or under the suzerainty of the Dhar emperor or Dhar kingdom. Now when it comes to Bhopal state, it was only in 1707 when Dost Muhammad decided to stay put in Bhopal and that it became Bhopal state, and Bhopal state acquired that. And even thereafter his successors could not stick to it. They had to wait till they had the treaty with the British in 1818 when it became little stable. So Bhopal state came into being very late, very, very late.
Right. Okay. Now nothing to do with your book. Just the last question. This question doesn't pertain to your book, General Naidu. I would like to know, because we have had first and the second, both happens to be from the army. Again, it's my analysis, and I would like your views on this with being an ex-vice chief. Don't you think there is a creeping plebeianism? Why it is so? Because earlier, when we talk about the Bhopal state, we talk about the British Her Majesty government's officers, army was a way of life. People used to join army not as an employment, not as a job. Maharaja Sahib of Jaipur, Colonel Bhavani Singh, why did he join? He won the MVC. So, that was not the way. What are your views on how the army is going to retain its mores, the essential traditions, the very essential core values which it has based in history, and let's put it more commonly, word used these days are its sanskar. Don't you think it's going to be eroded with this creeping plebeianism that we have now?
You are right, Vertul, very right. You see, originally we were not democratic. We were under a ruler, and therefore the ruler had a stake in the system, whatever was the system, to carry on with the system. And rulers had their own people who would support that system, and therefore it was a part of their culture to take up arms or be in arms. Now, this kind of thing has now finished with the proliferation of the middle class, and especially in a democracy. And now what is happening is, after all, the armed forces are a reflection of the society. We also come from the society. We have grown up in the society. Our values are the same as that of the society. So if good, bad, indifferent, it will come to the armed forces. And maybe armed forces will be able to kind of handle it for a little while, mold them into what they want. But we can't escape that. We have to agree, we have to accept that. And therefore, perhaps find some innovative ways of training them to mold them into the model that we want to have.
General Naidu, thank you so much. And we had full cooperation from the audience. Now I throw open the audience for questions,
Yes,
please.
sir. Because we are running short of time, we can have one question.
Has okay. When this Bhopal levy was raised, initially it was known as the Bhopal contingent. After 1857, it was called, for about 2 years, it was known as Bhopal levy. Thereafter, it was changed to Bhopal infantry. Then, just before the First World War, it became 9th Battalion Bhopal infantry. Therefore, it participated in the First World War as 9th Battalion Bhopal infantry. Between the First and Second World War, it became 4th Battalion, the 16th Punjab Regiment. After 1947, 4th Battalion, 16th Punjab Regiment was given to Pakistan as part of Division of Assets.
That's a
There
you mentioned it.
finally they became 17 Punjab. And the credit goes to the fact that 17 Punjab, in 1965, they were awarded Nishan-e-Haidar, which is the topmost award for bravery in Pakistan. And they say it is higher than Victoria Cross and also higher than Paramveer Chakra, because it has never been awarded to anyone alive. There have just been 13 of them.
You have mentioned about a Pakistani general also who happens to be your friend in this book. What forgetting the name? General Shahnawaz.
Tariq Ghazi.
Ah, yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, sir.
Small curiosity, General Naidu. In terms of competence, training, and quality, how did the Bhopal army compare with, let's say, the Nizam or the Jaipur or the Jodhpur Lancers, the Jodhpur guys?
There's no, you see, Bhopal army was infantry, Jaipur Lancers cavalry. So there's no comparison. It's something like comparing aloo with something else. No, but they have also got a big name. They have done well. Same as with the Bhopal infantry, they have got a VC. So I think they both were comparable.
Thank you so much, sir. It was rather a very interesting discussion. And now I'd like to invite on stage Ms. Meera Das ma'am to give away the mementos to our speaker and to our discussant. The painting which is being given is a tribal art painting by Bhuri Bai, who won the Padma Shri for art this year. Can we please have a huge round of applause, everyone?
There is a, I must also announce that a Hindi version of this is being made by a classmate of mine, Dr. Girijesh Saxena. He's a colonel, and he has already finished his manuscript, and it's with the publishers who are ferrying it out and doing the needful. So very soon you will find a Hindi version of the same.